every software now is going to have some sort of a conversational experience, and whether it's written or voice. And I wonder if finally the voice interface is going to have its golden hour, its golden moment in technology. We've had Alexa, Siri, and Google's Assistant forever, but people always ask tiny questions. It doesn't really have a ton of retention. They're always using them for the same use cases. If you attach an LLM that is incredibly powerful to it, you have this person that is next to you at all times, able to answer all of these different questions. I wonder what the impact of that will be, and if in a year from now the main search or web interface for us is going to be our headphones and voice. I wonder if we are going to see that happen from a consumer perspective.
Welcome, Collective Nation, to another installment of the GENAI Collective Podcast, Collective Intelligence. I'm your host, Thomas Joshi, ML researcher at Stanford, former ML engineer. The Collective Intelligence Community Podcast brings the brightest minds in AI to the table to discuss the field's most pertinent topics. Each interview provides a unique perspective on this industry, providing sharp insights, informed commentaries, shared to our growing community of founders, funders, and thought leaders. Today, we're joined by Santiago Pombo from ThoughtSpot, who is the Director of Product for the Search and AI product team. He has 10 plus years of experience from HP, Adobe, Meltwater. As many of you already know, ThoughtSpot is a leader in enterprise analytics and was named a visionary in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for Analytics and Business Intelligence. I'm so excited to have Santiago on the show because we have a lot of overlapping interests. For example, one of the problems I've been working on is converting natural language queries to SQL. And this opens up data access and insights to not just data analysts and scientists, but to everyone in the world. And Santiago obviously has a lot of experience democratizing access and insights to data. So with that, Santiago, please kind of tell us about where you grew up, education, and your prior work experiences.
Thank you so much for that great intro, Thomas. Delighted to be here. This is a very exciting podcast and a very exciting community. Shout out to the GENAI collective team that's been putting awesome events in San Francisco. If you are into GENAI, make sure that you attend the various events that they have with startups and so on. So, to just give you a brief recap, I was born and raised in Colombia, in Latin America. Then I lived there until I was 17. I moved to Washington, D.C. to finish high school. And what's interesting about that is that I actually went to a French educational system my entire life. And I finished high school in Washington, D.C. in the French International School. Then I went to university in Montreal, Canada. I graduated from there and I started my career in tech in Montreal. I was working for this small startup at the time, a Nordic startup called Meltwater. And they were in the media analysis, media monitoring and social media monitoring space. And this was really like early Web 2.0 company. This was perhaps the first company that did media monitoring at scale, particularly on social networks. And I joined them in an international management training program. So I got to do a number of different tasks and roles. I worked in sales, I worked in the marketing department, and then eventually I ended up in the product management role. And that's where I started my product management career. When I started my product management career, they moved me to San Francisco because this is where the headquarters were. And just to give you some context and to date myself a little bit, my first 2 weeks here in San Francisco was when the Facebook IPO happened. And so we were one of the early marketing partners to Facebook. And I remember going to like the roadmap reviews and being like, I need to buy the stock of this company. Like what they're doing is absolutely nuts. And interestingly enough, from those very early days, I started working on building tools for professionals. So in this case, we were developing the first tools for marketing and communications professionals to help them essentially keep track of everything that had to do with their brand online. Essentially, all of the data that their companies are generating outside of the firewall. Our role was to build essentially a search engine that collected all of that information, analyzed it, and created insights for them so they could better have an idea of what was happening with the brand. And the reason why I'm going into detail here is because it really ties nicely into what I'm doing today. Even in those early days, I was starting to get into natural language processing, sentiment analysis, things of that nature. But of course, so many things have changed since. The technology that was available then has completely been obsolete, relative to what we have now. Now, fast forward into the 11 years that I've been here in San Francisco, I kept this essentially theme of building tools for professionals. After Meltwater, I moved to Hewlett Packard, where I was building tools for developers. The main persona was developers, and I was building what at the time was really novel CI/CD tools for containerized applications and microservices-oriented architectures, which for the enterprise at the time was pretty novel. And then I moved to Adobe, and at Adobe, I really got to get much more deeply into machine learning oriented projects. I worked building tools for marketers and for creatives, and I got to build features around computer vision and natural language processing. And the idea was always to essentially democratize the access to creativity by people that might not have the technical skill needed to be incredible creators yet. So how can you leverage artificial intelligence to make the creative task more accessible, to give essentially creators superpowers, accelerate their workflows, things that are very technically challenging to do? Can you accelerate them using machine learning? So that was kind of the focus. And then after 6 years of being at Adobe, the team at ThoughtSpot reached out, and they reached out with the mission of, we are in the business of trying to make the world a more data-driven place. And so just to kind of introduce a little bit at a high level what ThoughtSpot does for your audience, as you mentioned, we are one of the leaders in the business intelligence space, but our angle has always been to really democratize insights for all of knowledge workers. And the focus of the company has always been a very search-centric company, where some of the other companies in the space are focused on essentially building queries and creating these dashboarding solutions. ThoughtSpot has this very rich background in search because both of our initial founders were, come from Google, worked at Bing, and they always thought about what would it be like to build the Google for business intelligence, for business analytics, for data analytics inside of the organization. And when they reached out saying that they really wanted to focus on this notion, this idea of really democratizing access to business insights, it felt like a great opportunity for me to jump into, and I decided to join the company. So that
okay.
gives
So I
you
think
a pretty big overview right there.
So some key insights. One is kind of how NLP has evolved as a space. I mean, kind of prior to 2015, I think the space was dominated by linguistics and people who could identify noun, verb, pronouns, and then use that to kind of identify patterns. And it's crazy to think that the people who ended up revolutionizing NLP were actually the people studying the brain and how the brain functions, not the people who are studying kind of sentence structure. So that's a cool concept you brought up. And second is this unlocking of kind of creative powers. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that I'm excited about for this next wave is, one is things that you could not have done before that required years of practice and study can be done in just a matter of hours or days. And so those are some key insights that really resonate with me. So given that background, let's just first do our traditional icebreakers that we do at every event just to get everyone to know each other. So could you just give us an example of if you could teach a course in anything, what would that be?
I feel that question is such a fascinating question, and I'd have a couple of contenders, but if I could pick one, it would be giving a course about the importance and the value of building a life-lasting hobby. And I do think the word hobby is a little bit of a misnomer because hobby implies a certain levity to like developing like a passion over time. But I think, it's surprising to me that many of my grown adult friends don't really have a hobby that they've been doing for their entirety of their lives. And I think that hobbies are an incredible vehicle to enrich your life in many ways. For me, my core hobbies, as you can probably tell, are music, fly fishing, and doing some sort of health activity. For the last few years, it's been boxing. But these are activities that I've done for like 15, 20 years and that I try to do at least a little bit of time every day. And for me, they're a great source of growth. They're a huge part of my identity. And what I like about like building hobbies is that you build this consistency that compounds over time, and that they end up transforming into like huge parts of who you are as a person. They allow you to socialize. It's a great source of company whenever you're feeling down or whenever you're, feeling lonely. you can always go back to this skill set, this activity that has been with you for so long that is never ending, is a quest that never ends, that you can keep building on top of. So, in short, I would try to create a course about like what is an easy way to build hobbies, and explain the value and the impact they've had in my life on the different vectors that I was mentioning.
Yeah. So I think one of my favorite books is The Talent Code by I remember the author, but the point of the book is to say that greatness in any endeavor is grown, not just born. So it talks about myelin, which kind of wraps around the brain to kind of speed up different circuits. And one of the ways I got into this kind of idea was through my hobbies. Is like, how do you improve not just over the course of a year, but over a course of a decade? And it takes things that seem trivial when you do them every day or every week over the course of a decade. It can offer a lot of meaning and satisfaction in your life. And then, as you kind of alluded to, you can find your group. So I think one of the biggest things is like moving to like San Francisco or Palo Alto. There's all these like different quirks and new hobbies that people have in the Valley that will expose you to. I mean, like for example, poker is like something that's pretty big in Silicon Valley, of like just kind of like playing with friends, and that'll expose you to like new thought. It'll improve, like expose you to probability and how to think through probability, and like you meet new people, you learn your risk tolerance, and you learn a lot about how you think about taking risks. But anyways, so thank you so much for giving that good example. So how about let's dive into what we're really here to talk about: generative AI and artificial intelligence in general. So can you share any success stories or use cases where ThoughtSpot has successfully implemented production-ready LLM-powered features or products, and what were the critical factors contributing to their success?
Okay, that's a pretty big question. I'm going to try to kind of structure it in a way, but maybe for the sake of your audience, we can take a little bit of step back, introduce a little bit more what ThoughtSpot is, what makes it slightly different, and then what is the key problem that we're trying to solve. So just to start and to level set, as I was mentioning, ThoughtSpot is a business intelligence platform, and our customers essentially rely on us to do all of their data analytics about business critical information that they're collecting. These are connected to their CDWs, their cloud data warehouses, and they use us to generate insights to make decisions that help them drive their business, right? And one of the key elements of most of the companies that are doing digital transformation is that they really want to empower not only their data scientists, their analysts, and their technical personas inside of the organization to be able to leverage data, but what they really want to do is they want to democratize all of their knowledge workers to be able to consume data and be able to get insights on their own. It's what's called democratizing BI. And everybody in the industry has been trying to chase this for a very long time. Now, what made ThoughtSpot very successful and what gave us really product market fit has always been this emphasis and focus on search. So our tool by design had always been a search-centric company. And what made the company very successful is that the founders, even before the advent of LLMs, had really been trying to crack this nut of enabling people to search for insights with natural language. And inside of the company, we had attempted many different approaches, tried to build our own models, use traditional natural language processing techniques to try to solve this problem. And through this process, we ended up building a very robust semantic layer, a semantic engine that essentially works as a little bit of as an abstraction on top of SQL. So it's a very deterministic abstraction that allows people to essentially write these tokens, these somewhat approximative, like natural language search queries, to compose very complex and accurate SQL statements. And so this was like a very good step towards making business intelligence more accessible for everyday users. But it wasn't really quite natural language per se. And so about a year ago, when I joined, previously at Adobe, I had been working on generative technologies inside of the AI and ML technology department. And I had done some experiments inside of the organization with GPT. Curiously, our founders had tried to use earlier versions of GPT for the main part of the process, which is one of the key parts is translating the user intent. so text to SQL, as we were mentioning beforehand. And what they had discovered with earlier versions of GPT, like GPT-2 and some of the earlier models, was that it was producing exciting results, but they were nowhere near as accurate as it would be needed for an enterprise solution.
Right.
They were a little bit discouraged by that, and they were trying to use some heuristical approaches, some other more standard natural language processing techniques to try to disambiguate the intent and so on and so forth. But when I joined, I had already been playing with GPT-3, and I brought back the idea to the founders: have you guys attempted to resolve this problem with GPT-3? And this was right before, maybe 6 or 7 months before the release of GPT 3.5 and ChatGPT and everything else that has happened since. And then we started building a POC using the GPT-3 APIs, and the results were literally a step function ahead of what they had been doing beforehand. And they had already a little bit of a testing data set that they had used for their previous initiatives. And we were getting incredible results on that benchmark that we had built beforehand. And so this kind of gave them more confidence that we should really try to resolve this problem. And again, the idea here is, if you can enable business users to express their data questions in natural language, and the output of that can be reliable, accurate, interpretable SQL, then all of a sudden you're lowering the barrier of entry for anybody inside of the organization to be able to ask business questions and get insights and be much more self-serve in the way they get business. Now, let me just stop there for a second and kind of gather your thoughts on that. We can then tackle the second part of the question, which is, how did we make this successful, and what's happening so far? But do you have any questions about that first portion?
Sure. I mean, I think one, we've seen the same things that you're seeing, right? Is that the language model improvement has been a step function improvement, especially with kind of natural language to query. I mean, two is that there is as you kind of alluded to, the opportunity is large, right? To enable anyone to be a data analyst and to be a data scientist in their own way. How do you think about positioning yourself a little bit differently than, there's a lot of players, like Alteryx has been trying to get into kind of the business intelligence, democratize for everyone space, especially in sort of, well, they've been in it for quite a while. You have kind of C3 AI that's come out with their own product. Is there any way you try to differentiate ThoughtSpot in that sense?
That's a fantastic question. And by the way, in the next, starting now for the past few months and for the next year, you're going to see a ton of these tools appear. In fact, I don't know if you know who Rahul Ligma is and so on, the guy that did the Twitter kind of person. He's a really interesting character, but he just launched just yesterday or like a couple of days ago, a similar tool that enables anybody to essentially do text to SQL for connected type of data sources. The reason why ThoughtSpot is in a great position and we are actually able to deliver this for big enterprises is because ThoughtSpot has been working on this very same problem for 10 years. And it has a very robust semantic engine that makes this whole thing work. Whereas a lot of companies are going to make the LLM the primary source of intelligence for their entire stack. Essentially, they're going to build a wrapper on top of it.
Right.
For us, GPT or the LLM performs one transaction, one single data transmission that allows us to do just a tiny step in an entire pipeline of things that makes this much more deterministic. The key challenge in BI is that, as you know, LLMs are probabilistic systems, and they will tend to hallucinate and they will provide inaccurate results. When you are creating a blog post, when you are creating an image or something like that, the result of a false positive or like of a hallucination is not that dangerous. It can be actually cute and creative and so on. In the BI space, if somebody asks for profit or revenue and you give them the wrong number, that just does not fly. It's a business of trust. And so the magic sauce of ThoughtSpot is that we have this entire system that helps us steer and control the output of the LLM. So at a high level, we have a bunch of pre-processing that happens when the user is typing the query in the search box. That helps us disambiguate and provide a lot of information to the LLM inside of the prompt. Then we issue the prompt to the LLM. The LLM, we only really use them for that like text to SQL translation. It's that coding ability that makes LLM so robust, that is very valuable. Then once we get that SQL, we essentially transform it into the secondary language that I was mentioning to you, this DSL, domain specific language, that is an abstraction on top of SQL. And what's valuable about that language is that that language is much more interpretable than SQL is.
Yes.
And so for your earlier question, like what are some of the critical factors that have determined the successful implementation of what we're doing? When we started developing the POC and the first implementation of what we call Sage, which is this natural language sort of assistant that allows you to ask questions in natural language, we try to come up with some operating principles that will help us truly steer the value of the LLM. So the first thing is we really wanted to focus on being able to build highly interpretable results that can build trust, because precisely in BI, understanding how an answer is created is of utmost importance. So in the current experience, when you ask a question, we generate a chart. And that chart comes with a natural language description of the chart, an interactive chart that you can drill down, that you can modify, that you can do a number of things to. But there's also an explanation of which measures, which attributes, which filter values were added to create that answer. And so instead of having to review the SQL that was generated for that answer, a business user or a data analyst can very quickly see what dimensions, what measures were used to create that answer, which gives an extra layer of interpretability. That layer of interpretability, that level of trust, is not something that people are just going to be able to build right off the bat. And you know, I don't know, like if I can go into a lot of detail about like some of the other things, but we have a pre-processing step and we have a post-processing step. And in between is the LLM. And the real magic sauce is in between the pre-processing and the post-processing that help us make these probabilistic generations into more deterministic outcomes for our customers. And that's why like I think it's going to be hard for companies to compete. They will obviously compete, but essentially companies are going to start LLM first. Whereas for us, the LLM is just a portion of a battle-tested system that has been generating insights reliably for customers for a decade. So hopefully that answers a little bit more the differentiation question that you were asking.
Yeah, so you brought so many good points that I want to go back to. So one is this idea of your secret sauce being your system design. So this is something that we literally have a slide on. So it's crazy that we agree on this, because at least my group, we focus a lot on this. We think that at least one of the biggest things that I work on is how do you create an abstraction over any LLM so that you can plug and play an LLM, so it's very easy to plug into our system. And then once you have that, we believe that kind of your secret sauce won't be just how well you can fine tune a model or what model you use, but then how you can use that LLM into a series of pipelines where you can do prompt engineering, not as kind of rote manual process, but as you can kind of plug and play different prompts. You can generate prompts for your in an automatic way for your user. So it's crazy that we kind of came to the same conclusion from kind of two different worlds. And then the second is this idea of hallucination. This is something that we connected on when you were at our summit. And right, so I think we both have these similar backgrounds. Your background kind of data analytics world. My background was using LLMs for healthcare and finance, where I realized the current, even with BERT and some of these prior large language models, the ability to just have no issues whatsoever, no errors are tolerated in healthcare. When we're building a medical chatbot, no issues in identifying different analytics in a financial document. I think we both come from this background of errors are not tolerated. You have to have a near perfect system in order to replace humans, right? And we're seeing the same pattern in autonomous vehicles. They have to be a step function better than a human driver in order to replace humans. And I think the third thing that I want to touch upon is this idea of interpretability. I think back when you were looking at neural networks in 2016 and 2018, one of the things that people were saying is, oh, we like to use things like a forest or more traditional ML methodologies because they're highly interpretable. And we don't use deep learning because we don't really know what's going on in the black box. I think there's been a lot of research that has come out in the past 5 years on attention mechanisms. So studying the attention heads and seeing what types of concepts they're learning. I guess from moving from that, I mean, how are you thinking about this concentration on prompt engineering? Like, do you see prompt engineering as something that's here to stay, or kind of, is kind of a passing fad?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you in our own experience that prompt engineering for this task has been very successful in some ways and underwhelming in some other ways. Chain of thought is supposed to be like incredibly useful and increase accuracy. And to be honest, we're still kind of working with it to try to make it satisfy our use cases and really meaningfully increase accuracy on our benchmark. I don't know that I can predict the future of prompt engineering. Arguably, as LLMs become better, larger, or maybe not even larger, but this mixture of experts approaches that are happening. Who knows if eventually the LLMs will be so performant that like you won't require to give them that much instruction upfront to be able to steer them. But I do think that is fascinating that natural language essentially becomes a programming language for systems. And to me, that is incredible that people that have no technical knowledge are able to provide precise commands in natural language to a system, and based on that language that they're familiar with, alter very much the behavior of a system to generate different things. I think that's incredibly powerful and one of the coolest things that these LLMs have moved forward. So will there be prompt engineering careers in 5 years? I don't know. A lot of people that are smarter than me think that is not the case. But my experience so far and that of my team is that prompt engineering has made a difference for our tasks. So at least in the current state of things, it definitely makes a difference for what we are trying to do. That's what I would say. Now, I did want to mention something else beforehand that I would love your audience to really at least be able to learn from our experience. When we are generating products for the enterprise with LLMs, I think, and this goes back a little bit to the prompt engineering question, but more importantly, like the importance of having humans in the loop to be able to provide feedback and override the outputs of the LLMs. Like, and a critical component that has made our products successful right now with enterprise users and for them to feel comfortable rolling this out into production is that our users feel very much in control of how the LLMs are outputting results. We have this very nicely built feedback mechanism where users can essentially, if they don't like a generation, because obviously we are going to make mistakes. Like right now, we are witnessing around 85% accuracy in our benchmark across like our like 70 plus customers that are using this. Our users are able to override and provide direct feedback, which we use inside of the. And why I'm bringing this up to the fine-tuning example is that the prompt engineering example is that when our customers are giving us feedback, we obviously store all of that feedback, but we use it to generate few shot examples that we prompt for future questions. Whenever they ask adjacent questions, like not the same identical question, but adjacent questions that are using the same entities, we can better steer the models. So the reason why I wanted to bring that up is because indeed feedback from humans is what allows you to essentially steer a little bit better the LLMs, and in our case, to improve our prompt engineering.
And I think you bring up a good point in that to not diminish the role of prompt engineering in getting high accuracy. And the way I kind of would explain this to people who think prompt engineering is kind of, it's kind of a hack. Well, you have this LM, and you can think of that as a system. And what you're doing with prompt engineering is it's like a signals and systems problem where you have a stimulus of a natural language, and you're trying to see what you can get out of this black box from that one input signal. What is the output signal?
And that's the main input. That's the main input.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, it's really to do effective prompt engineering, you're developing an understanding of what the LLM responds to best, and in doing so, it's like you're studying an organism. Like you can think of this LLM as this like kind of conscious being that, you know, when you give it certain inputs, it provides higher quality outputs, and that's not a trite thing. It's actually developing a better understanding, at least from a behavioral perspective, maybe not in a kind of mechanical underlying how it works, but you're understanding its behavior a lot better. So I wouldn't belittle it too much, right? I still think it is kind of, when I see like a file with like 10 different prompts that are all handwritten out, it can be a bit like, are we really going to do this? Are we really going to do this kind of manual system? But it's also, on the other hand, there's another take to that, another side to that story.
I love that you always bring it back. You've done it already a couple of times in the podcast to essentially biology or like behavioral neuroscience or neuroscience concepts, and I very much think that that's the right approach, and I love it. Did you happen to study neuroscience or something like that in university?
So I didn't. So I read in high school. I read every psychology book I could get my hands on, and then when I got to college, I was like most of the studies that they talk about are ones that you're not able to test them, and the only ones that are really make it into like books and have books written about them are the effective studies. So it was like, what was the point of kind of taking, you know, the courses in university if I'd already kind of read the great psychology books? But I think that informs a lot of my understanding of how I work. The reason I was so interested is to understand how my mind works, right? But then I realized there's a wide range of applications you could use to LLMs and how they behave. And I think, you know, Andre Karpathy, you know, he talks about like one of his favorite books is a neuroscience book, and that informs how he goes about his research. Obviously, you know, Hinton and all those great elite thought leaders got their inspiration from your neurons and all that. So I think there is a lot of precedent here.
We share that same passion. I did 2 degrees in university, and one of them was psychology, and I focused a lot on behavioral neuroscience and social psych, and it was precisely that. I think my interest in artificial intelligence definitely spawns from having spent, you know, whatever, like a number of years studying psychology and behavioral neuroscience, and just the idea of intelligence and how the brain works, like how neurons work, how action potentials work. To me, that was definitely some of the most fascinating things I studied in, you know, both in school and university. I thought those were fascinating. So glad to know that we have that little connection and interest. But yeah, like, okay, side note, but that was cool. I like how you always bring it to like essentially biological systems. It's
and one thing, other thing I'll say on this topic is we'll see how far we can take this metaphor, right? Like you know, the idea, like there's been some conversations around transformers. Like, is this it? Is this our, like the design of the semiconductor back in like the 50s, 60s, whatever it was, by, you know, Shockley and all those people, like that was basically the structure that we used for decades. Will the transformer be the final architecture there? Yeah.
So, you know, okay, I know that we're getting a little bit on a tangent, but I think this will be interesting for your audience. Karpathy recently was at a hackathon. I don't know where it was, but one of his key sentences there is like, what is the hippocampus of the transformer? So the hippocampus is memory, right? And right now there's a ton of research that is happening on the role of memory in LLMs, and how do you give them memory? How do you chain them? How do you make them remember? So very much to your point, maybe the architecture will change. Maybe this memory thing is like a big part of it, and it's inspired as well from, you know, our own biology. So it's, really cool. Actually, I think that both reflection and memory are the 2 things that I'm most excited about right now in terms of the research that's happening with LLMs.
And one other thing that someone mentioned to me, I was just having a coffee chat with an AI engineer, and they were saying, like, if you think about like what LLMs are inherently restricted in that, would you imagine you had a child and you just kind of locked them in a dark room and you had them read books all day, and that was their sole understanding of the world and the universe? Like, what kind of concepts would they extract from that experience? When in reality, the way we learn most of our concepts is a joint between the visual and reading. So what types, and also if you think about the context window, it's highly restrictive compared to the inputs of a visual model. So there's so much more. Like right now, we're just restricting these LLMs to just reading. Imagine when we enable them with
Full
multimodal.
multimodal, yeah.
Yeah, and not just, and a lot of people say, oh, multimodal, like I worked on multimodal analysis using deep canonical correlation analysis. But that was really just trying to find similarities between different sort of text and image pairs and trying to find similarities. But what I'm saying is, what if we could take that a step further and a multimodal analysis could be even better in text processing, because they have even a greater understanding of the world and concepts in the world from both the visual, what they can see, and from what they read. So anyways,
Totally.
yeah,
Totally.
I mean, I kind of moving to our next topic here.
Let's pin on that, because we could definitely have a lot of interesting conversations on that topic. I would love to follow up on that.
Sure. So what are some challenges or common pitfalls that you see organizations facing when trying to deploy LM-powered features or products in production, and how can they be overcome? And this is really pertinent to questions I get a lot at our summits, because we have a lot of founders that are building these products and they're really in the early stages and trying to kind of wade through the dark.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, and perhaps the most important question, I think, that you could ask. I would say that there are two key challenges that come to mind and that I am seeing and that we went through as well. The first one is that it's very easy to build an impressive demo with LLMs. Like the base technology that this empowers your application to have is really, really high. So you can really create a very compelling thing that demos well. But it's much more difficult to build a robust product that will meet enterprise requirements and even consumer requirements. So, and you can actually start seeing that as people are using more and more LLMs, they're encountering more and more kinks around them. So I would say essentially is the difference between building a demo versus building a product. And we can talk a little bit more about that. I can share like a few insights there. The second one is, even if you are able to build a product and a real robust thing that people will be able to use and rely on, how do you differentiate it, and how do you create the quote unquote moat so that it's not just the wrapper on top of the LLM? So we can tackle those separately. I'd say one of the key questions that you have to ask yourself when you are building a product based on LLMs is, what is your data story? Essentially, how will you measure the success that the LLM is having for the tasks that you're putting it to do? And for me, one of the biggest learning lessons of just working on this project for the past year or so is the importance of having an incredible benchmark, a test data set that is essentially your ground truth for, are we doing a good job? And what does doing a good job really mean? I know this sounds like fairly basic for a data scientist that like is used to training, machine learning models and so on. But for people that are essentially maybe software companies that don't have a background in machine learning and they're starting to work with LLMs, they will try to do some tasks. How do you use the data that you have to provide you a ground truth, and so that you can evaluate pragmatically if the LLM is actually helping you perform that task? That sounds very essential, but I can tell you it's not that simple, and it's very much at the core of the success of what makes a real product a real product. So let me just give you an example. In text to SQL, as many of your listeners might know, there are quite a few available open source benchmarks. And so what a benchmark is in text to SQL is essentially a corpus of questions that have natural language questions and their SQL output. And the most famous one is called Spider.
Yep.
There's a few other ones that have appeared that are very interesting, like SPAC and BERT. And actually, BERT is the most complex one. Yep. And it's really, pretty hardcore. But when we were, and as I mentioned, internally in our company, we also had some initial benchmarks that we had created from previous attempts to solving this problem. Mm-hmm. But what we discovered with Spider is that Spider wasn't truly really representative of the complexity and of the types of questions that our customers ask. Mm. Because what happens with business intelligence is that the type of language that every customer uses is very much unique to their organization. The type of questions that they ask, the acronyms that they use, the length and the complexity, the number of tokens that are used in the queries are different. So essentially what we realized is that even if we were performing okay in Spider, we needed to supplement available open source benchmarks with real use cases of real customers asking real business questions to see if we could actually perform and do well. And so the first question that I would ask as a company is, do we have access to proprietary data that can help us build an awesome benchmark? That's a good starting point. Through your system, as your customers are using your product, and this applies for companies that are not 0 to 1 companies, but companies that maybe are already in market and that are trying to build something with LLMs. How can you use your proprietary data to essentially build a very interesting benchmark that will help you assess the quality of the LLM? The second thing is, as we were mentioning, the importance of having continuous feedback. Once you release this and you release it to some customers, the ability to collect that feedback, to add it to your benchmark, to enrich your benchmark, will help you build a better, more robust, essentially LLM output. You also have to think about, okay, when I'm building this system, do my T's and C's, my contracts with our customers, the data collection that I'm doing, does that cover me, and does that allow me to use now all of this input to essentially send it to an LLM to maybe fine tune an LLM? Like what is my legal approach and my legal coverage? That's also something that I would encourage companies to look into, especially customer opt-in. If you don't have that as part of your current contract, you definitely want to change that and have a conversation with your customers about it. And then another learning lesson for us, and I hope that this helps some of your listeners, is the benchmark output has to become an essential part of your CI/CD pipeline. What was happening to us in the early days of developing the system is that we would change a part of our pipeline, we would add a new heuristic, we would maybe make a change in our prompt, and it would do great in some questions, but it would tank some other questions. And so we didn't really know what was the actual output and total performance on the benchmark. And if you are making changes to your LLM-oriented pipeline, you should make it give you an output so that you are honest with yourself. You keep your team honest and you see, is this actually improving the performance of the LLM and the task or not? And if it's not, and if it's hurting it, or if it's regressing, then you obviously shouldn't, you should revisit the pull request, and you should revisit your code changes. And making that benchmark part of your CI/CD thing is a good thing, because otherwise you're doing one step forward, 2 step back, 1 step forward, 2 step back. And that was essentially what was happening to us. Now we have a much more rigorous, essentially, development pipeline, if you will, for our functionality, where we're constantly checking if the changes that we're making to the system impact positively the benchmark. And that helps us build a more robust, resilient, and kind of useful LLM feature, LLM powered feature. Does that make sense? Does that resonate with you?
No, definitely. I mean, one thing that I had issues with when I was kind of earlier on in my journey is I would just look at accuracy. And some of the kind of more senior engineers would ask me, well, why did you choose this metric? Why does this make sense in our in our pipeline? Why not? Why are we using precision? Why are we using recall? Right. What other metrics could we be using? And I think in particular, when you're looking at medical applications, your metric design is critically important, where you're in situations where being incorrect is worse. If you're trying to detect for some disease, being incorrect in detection is worse than just saying someone has a disease and kind of going to a doctor, right? So leaning toward, so the way, depending on your application, you have to lean your metrics toward that application. So definitely metric design is something that engineers, is an afterthought to engineers, just like testing and all these other things around the actual building process. That shouldn't be, and we should probably spend a lot more time thinking through these challenges. So a great point you bring up. Can you share some of these best practices for ensuring the scalability and reliability of LLM-powered features, or products in a production environment, one thing that we're viewing is we might be able to get high accuracy, but the latency that we have on these open APIs it just doesn't work in a real-time environment.
Yeah, you're 100% right. I think obviously you are going to have a trade-off between accuracy, latency, and cost. The larger your context window, the larger the model, perhaps the more accurate the output of the LLM is going to be, but also the longer it's going to take and the more expensive it's going to get to make the inference. So another good tip, obviously the first question is, should we build our own LLM? Should we fine-tune an open source model, or should we buy? Which means, do I use a cloud provider? I would assume for most companies, at least in their initial stages, the easiest thing to do is just to try an API and just to use a cloud provider. In the enterprise, there are a lot of benefits about building your own model and fine-tuning your own model. But because a lot of enterprise customers don't want to send anything to OpenAI, they don't want to send anything to Google, they don't want to send anything to any of the big companies because they care very much about data sovereignty. And so we can have a whole other conversation about how you have to address that with enterprise customers. But to your initial question, this might sound obvious to many, but not every task needs GPT-4. Not every task needs the largest model available. You definitely can combine multiple versions of the different models and split them by the different use cases that you're using LLM for to get the optimal value and cost ratio for the transactions that we're trying to do. So just to be 100% honest, for our core task for text to SQL, we use it in many other ways. Like we create descriptions, we do summaries, we do insights, we do a number of other things, synonyms. But for the core text to SQL, GPT-4 provides by far the best results baseline. Mm-hmm. And it helps us essentially get some of the performance that we get off the bat with some heuristics that we've built as part of our pipeline that I was mentioning with some of the other models. It's also particularly useful when you are trying to support international locales. So GPT-4 has much higher degree of multilingual support than a GPT 3.5 and some of the other versions. But where it didn't work really for us was latency. Latency was a killer. And the few seconds that it would take extra of latency simply didn't allow us to necessarily use it as our primary model for the task. And I would actually say, as an advice, and this has been my experience, maybe other folks will have a different experience, but selecting the right cloud provider for latency and robustness and support makes a huge difference for us. We work with Azure Cognitive Services, their OpenAI API, and what we discovered, not to shit talk about OpenAI, we found their services to be more performant, more scalable, more reliable than OpenAI, lower latency as well. So, at the end of the day, we ended up choosing a combination of GPT 3.5T, a DaVinci Text, and DaVinci Code 03 to do different tasks. We still use GPT-4 for certain things, but we discovered that for us, there was definitely a trade-off between latency and accuracy that was not quite there. So I would encourage folks to obviously try the different models out there and always be mindful of doing that. Another good tip is running jobs asynchronously, batching requests for your different use cases, and also the value of caching results. You don't have to issue the same query many, many times. So in our use case, for example, it is likely that customers are going to be asking the same question multiple times in time. Do you always have to send that request to the LLM? No, not necessarily. So in our instance, for example, when customers give us positive feedback, or we have other strong signals that an existing generation is really good, we cache the results. And then we use that in a more deterministic manner to answer the question exactly like they wanted to, and they got positive feedback in the first time. So if I had to summarize those, obviously do the evaluation of build versus buy. If you have a very strong data story where you have incredible proprietary data and you have already some interesting machine learning talent in your company, plus the requirements of big enterprises of like deploying things on premise or security, building might be the right thing for you. If not, buy or rent, let's put it that way. Second thing is addressing accuracy, latency, and cost trade-offs, and understanding that you can combine multiple models that feed best the different tasks that you're doing to achieve what you want. Think about asynchronous job, batching jobs, and doing some caching. And if you combine all of those, hopefully you will get like a more performant system going forward. These sound, I feel like I'm saying fairly like standard things, but these are the things that have helped us build like a production ready system.
Not at all, because first to quickly hit on the point of sort of fine tune versus use an API. I mean, I'm really sort of deep into the AI community and startup community in San Francisco, and so I was thinking, like, you know, what's the point of fine tuning? Why would anyone fine tune now, given all the papers I'm reading, you know, on you know, the performance between, you know, an API versus fine tuning your own model. I was speaking to an AI founder who signs contracts with large enterprises. And he's like, no, we have to fine tune models because they have really high quality, large data sets, and they can't just send that data to you know, another provider. They have to keep it in-house, or the application is such that you need real time, like, you know, self-driving cars and all those applications, where it has to be real time and it has to be at a model at the edge.
Exactly. Deployed locally. Yeah.
Exactly. And then the second thing you mentioned about kind of, you know, using cognitive services versus OpenAI's API. This is why it's so important to create abstractions around your language model and who provides that. Because if you don't, then you'll be stuck with either an old API version of the model, or you won't be able to switch between providers. So creating abstraction and good code structure around that is critically important. And this idea of caching, it was important in scaling Web 2.0, and it's important now with, you know, before it was kind of, you know, web requests to a server. Now it's requests to an AI model. And caching is still going to be important.
Exactly. Yes. You nailed that. And I would say to the story or the anecdote that you were mentioning, I cannot express enough. If you're trying to build for the enterprise, data retention is a deal breaker, right?
Yes.
If your customers are banks, if your customers are hospitals, if your customers are telco companies, essentially any business critical workload out there running in the world, you cannot send anything to a third-party API and they cannot retain anything. Thankfully for us, Microsoft Cognitive Services have been very like accepting of that, and they understand that. So whenever we send data, we're really just doing it for inference, and they don't retain it at all. There's no data that is persisted anywhere outside of ThoughtSpot for our customers. But even then, even with that in mind, like, you know, as part of the prompt, you do send some information about the tables, some labels, some sample data. So customers are the real big enterprise customers that we have. You know, think Fortune 50 large companies that everybody uses and so on and so forth. They don't want any of that. So they'd be like, use our own LLM. Like they're building their own LLM, so use that. Or do you have an open source, or do you have like your own on-premise model that we could do? So I think the co-founder that you're talking about is very astute. And I definitely see that as it will be a likely outcome of everything that's happening in the open source community and the high performance that open source communities, smaller models, are achieving at specific tasks.
Totally. And I think it makes me feel a lot better because I spent a lot of the 2019, 2020, like many of the prior years, focused a lot on fine tuning models and algorithms around that. And I was kind of sad that now that skill set isn't as useful. But then I realized, like, wait, this is still useful for large enterprises who need to fine tune their own model. Not everyone's just going to be pinging an API. So with that, you know, how do you approach the continuous improvement and refinement of LLM models in a production environment? Like, what strategies do you suggest for handling model updates and retraining? I mean, in my prior experiences, we went through a lot of hard work of decoupling our deployments from the software engineering teams and creating our own ML engineering pipeline so we could deploy at our own scale, at our own sort of pace, do A/B testing on those model endpoints. Maybe you can kind of dive into that.
Yeah, 100%. I think we already touched a little bit on it, but the key insight that I have so far this year is making that LLM benchmark a key part of our CD pipeline, right? Making sure that whenever we touch any code that could affect like the inference part, that we are accounting for that change, that we are measuring the impact of that change, because it's very easy to do, as I mentioned, one step forward, two step back, one step forward, or whatever, you know, two step forward, one step back. Like, you want to make sure that you are not regressing the experience for the user. And in this case, the regression comes as a form of, are you still able to answer the questions that you were able to answer beforehand? And that's the importance. If there is one message that I can communicate to your teams or to the people, is like, have a nice benchmark, have a nice ground truth, nurture it, build it, and make it robust, representative, unbiased as possible.
Right.
And that's your ground truth, and make it a big part of your CD pipeline, and make sure that you're accountable to it. From a more tactical perspective, I know that there's an emergence of new ML ops tools out there, like Gantry or like Weights and Biases as now like a prompts thing.
Yep.
We're starting to experiment with some of those. I think we don't know what's going to happen to prompt engineering in the future, right? But as I was mentioning, it's still a pretty important part of what we're doing. Having a way of versioning those prompts and of assessing the impact of those prompts in a way that I have this vision, and maybe it's like a romantic vision or whatever, but democratizing prompt writing to not just the people that are deep in it, like, my engineering team or myself, but maybe some other stakeholders in the organization, and allowing them to provide some input and being able to quickly test that and see whether that has an impact or not, because it's low cost. It would be awesome. I don't know if it would really move the needle or not, but I have this notion that democratizing prompt writing inside of the organization for specific tasks might yield some interesting results. Having the tooling that allows you to do that is still TBD for me. I know that there's some companies that are trying to provide services that allow you to do that. So it's still early innings for us from that regard. But yeah, I would say those are kind of the two things that jump to mind.
Got it. Well, so thank you so much for that summary. I think final question, so as we wrap up here, what is the GenAI industry or AI industry in as a whole going to look like in 1 year? We would originally, typically when this question is asked, it's 5 years, but there you just can't tell. I mean, there's too much groundbreaking things that are happening every quarter. So maybe just 1 year out.
Yeah. Maybe I can answer this question from two perspectives. One from first as a consumer of technology, and the other one as a technical or I guess a technology that's trying to build things with it. From a consumer perspective, I think what's interesting about LLMs is that every software now is going to have some sort of a conversational experience, and whether it's written or voice. And I wonder if finally the voice interface is going to have its golden hour, its golden moment in technology. We've had Alexa, Siri, and Google's Assistant forever, but people always ask tiny questions. It doesn't really have a ton of retention. They're always using them for the same use cases. If you attach an LLM that is incredibly powerful to it, you have this person that is next to you at all times, able to answer all of these different questions. I wonder what the impact of that will be, and if in a year from now the main search or web interface for us is going to be our headphones and voice. I wonder if we are going to see that happen from a consumer perspective. And if that happens, I wonder if we are going to get into something like a conversation fatigue. If every website that I visit has a chatbot, if every SaaS product that I use has some sort of an assistant, does that get repetitive? Do we really need all of that conversation? It will be interesting to see, because everybody right now, it's an arms race, right? Everybody's trying to launch their assistant. Everybody's trying to launch their copilot or whatever. It's kind of like a game theory coordination problem. Prisoner's dilemma. If everybody has the same thing and is doing the same thing, what is the optimal equilibrium? What's the Nash equilibrium? Are you ending in a suboptimal equilibrium because everybody's doing the same thing? Hard to tell. Even though I'm a techno optimist, though, I do think that as this becomes more widespread, the consumers are going to go a little bit to a trough of disillusionment within the next 12 months. It's very encouraging to see the incredible research that's coming out all the time. Every day there's a new groundbreaking problem and a new groundbreaking paper with new state of the art in this task or that task. The pace is relentless and it's really hard to keep track of everything that's happening. But I think it'll be interesting in a year from now to see how many companies were able to deliver sustained value that was needle moving for customers with LLMs, because of all of the challenges that we were talking about. So I think that will be one thing. Now, from a technology perspective, I think that we are going to see the emergence of these verticalized LLMs. So open source models are starting to become really interesting from a performance cost perspective. From a unit economics perspective, they're great. And even though, there's an arms race between Anthropic, Cohere, and OpenAI to like try to lower the cost with incredible inference capabilities. The security data sovereignty thing that we're talking about enterprises makes it very attractive for people to try to do their own LLMs. And given that a lot of companies have proprietary data, I can imagine that there's going to be an LLM that is expert for like a Harvey AI, right? Like just
Right.
for law. There's going to be one for medical, even though Google has their own medical thing and they have partnerships with lots of hospitals and have a lot of this data. You can imagine that there's going to be so many specialized LLMs. And if they can be deployed at the edge, like you were mentioning, what is the role of it's very interesting. I heard, I think he was the CEO of Box say this, and it really resonated with me, which is when the advent of the mobile device came out, everybody knew what were the platforms that you had to build on top of. You had to build on top of iOS or Android. And you had two distribution platforms. So you had like technical talent that did this and that, and then you build your apps on top of those and you're good. With the new platform is clearly like the LLM or the machine learning model, right? Even though they become kind of like commoditized parts of your architecture, who do you build it for? Can you transfer your prompts and all of the work that you've done across models? Do they work exactly the same? Do you do it with your own stuff? Do you do it with like a third party that has state of the art like OpenAI? It's interesting. For the first time, it's really hard to kind of predict what's going to be the victor. And if I was a betting man, I think my prediction would be that it's probably going to go the same way that cloud went, which is there will probably be hybrid models. Some people will use public cloud for some workloads as part of their organization, and then some of the workloads will run on premise. And most likely the same thing will happen. I mean, if I was a betting man, I think that that's likely how it's going to turn out. So
there's so many key things that to kind of recap on what you just said. One is this trough of disillusionment. If you think about the easiness of a web page, it's see, click. Whereas if you're engaging with the language model, it's higher output, but it's also multiple typing and expressing what you think. Or if it's through speech, it's you have to talk through what you want. So you think there are definitely applications where just one click and just have what you want be on the page is going to be great for applications where you don't need to kind of do development of what you need. Whereas, if you want to go deeper, I think some of these applications like typing out or speaking what you want will be more applicable. This idea of kind of verticalized LLMs. So I think we kind of hit upon the idea of proprietary data. Second, the customization of having control over how those LLMs are deployed is critically important. And then finally, this idea of LLMs as cloud providers. I totally agree. I think one of the ways I describe it is LLMs are kind of like these facilities. It's like your data centers that you were built out. And there's a lot of CapEx that's required to build these data centers. There's a lot of CapEx required to build these LLMs. But once they're built, those people who built these large language models will be able to rent them out, kind of like the TSMC model or the way what cloud providers have done for data centers. And you'll be able to rent these out. And maybe not everyone uses those, right? Sometimes it's better to build your own infrastructure. But on occasion, it'll be better just to use the scope and the scale that some of these providers have and can offer.
I love that idea, Thomas. Like if Harvey AI ends up building the most accurate LLM for legal tasks, maybe they want to provide API access to other companies that need that data. And maybe they disintermediate OpenAI. Maybe people no longer use GPT-X for legal tasks, but maybe they use Harvey's thing. Yeah, maybe it's interesting. It's super interesting. And that's slightly different because not everybody in the past could provide cloud services, right? You needed to have the ability to operate infrastructure at scale. And there's like 5 companies in the world that can do that type of work. But if you have very interesting proprietary data and you're using a very solid base foundation model that is open source, whether it's Llama, whether it's whatever stabilities or whatever for whatever your task is, then you can start renting out your element. Let's even take it a step further. and let's go into image generation. You are a very famous artist, a musician. I'm a musician, and people want to generate songs based on me. Can I rent my personalized LLM?
Yeah.
If I'm a designer, if I'm an artist, like a painter or something like that, my likeness, my voice. Can Samuel L. Jackson or Morgan Freeman rent his own version of the LLM that is copyrighted? And anytime anybody in eternity wants to have the Morgan Freeman voice in his documentary or whatever, they have to pay this LLM. That's a brave new world right there. We have like personal agents that we rent out for use.
And one quick thing on that point is that, in prior generations or prior economic structures, the land and acquiring of land was the way people became wealthy.
Yep.
What if kind of not just the ownership of land, but also of content and material, and the more materials that you have and are able to rent that out for others to use and share and to kind of use your likeness, that'll also be a really great sort of opportunity for people, for content creators online, to access sort of new forms of income, and will kind of further push the creator economy forward.
100%. That's super interesting. I really like that. Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for sharing that. That definitely sparked some interesting thoughts in my head.
Yeah, of course. Well, with that, thank you so much, Santiago. So to kind of wrap up what we've talked about in this episode, right? We've started out with the problem, which is kind of a shared interest between me and Santiago. How do we democratize human creativity and insight, whether that's through kind of creating new content, or in our case, democratizing access to data and insights from data. And we moved a little bit deeper into literally specifics on how ThoughtSpot thinks about this, what their competitive mode is in this space, and then kind of challenges that we've seen and lessons we've learned deploying these models into production, whether to fine-tune models, ping an API. Once you have that at an endpoint, how are you scaling that? How are you measuring that? And then we kind of wrapped up with this vision of what AI will look like in a year from now. So, with that, I think the biggest takeaway is I take away from kind of Santiago's thinking is this a structure. A lot of people have an understanding of the problems, but I think, Santiago, you kind of have an ability to think about how to deploy that in the real world and take those brilliant ideas, but also kind of a practical slant to that. So I really appreciate your insight. And so thank you to everyone who's listened so far. Once again, thank you to the Collective Nation. Hope to see you at some of our events. Thank you for listening, and hopefully you've taken a little bit away from this conversation.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for your audience. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys. Bye-bye.